We're thrilled to have our next two guests, and this is going to be the final event in our disinformation series. It's been really successful, and we hope to do it again next year. Craig Silverman is indeed an award-winning journalist and author and expert on online disinformation and digital investigations. Currently a reporter for ProPublica from Halifax originally too, then via Montreal, and now we have him in Toronto on Montrose Avenue, and we're grateful for him being in our midst. Craig previously served as a media editor of BuzzFeed News and the founding editor of BuzzFeed Canada, which was such a great platform, and is also a West Ender too. We've been lucky to pair him with Chloe Brown. Chloe's been here before. We had a great town hall with Chloe when she ran for mayor in the springtime. She's a policy analyst and self-acclaimed firebrand. Can you call yourself a firebrand? I'm going to call you a firebrand anyways too. Currently works at the Future Skills Center, analyzing public-funded workforce and labor market development programs. But two superstars in our midst to talk about the world that we live in. Round of applause for Craig and Chloe.
Thank you, Dave. Thanks for showing up on a beautiful Saturday afternoon where there's street fairs all in the neighborhood, right? So, thank you. So, all right. So here's sort of what Chloe and I think we're going to do here. So, obviously, the topic is kind of focused around this chaotic information environment that we're in, and we're focused on kind of like navigating it. What does that feel like? What are the dynamics of this information environment that we're living in? And also some advice and some tips, talking sort of from our perspective where we come from on that in our own experience. And so as you kind of heard from the bios, we're coming from sort of two different places, and Chloe working as a policy analyst, but also having run for mayor. And when you put yourself in the limelight like that, obviously you have an experience that's different than folks who are sort of going about our lives. And so she's going to talk a bit about sort of her experience in this information environment, as a candidate, but also in a job that is very information oriented as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of having a job of investigating kind of this information environment, which is kind of what I tend to focus on. So we're going to each kind of talk a little bit from that perspective, have a little conversation. She's the firebrand. I am not the firebrand. So I'll be much more boring, I'm sure. And then we are excited to have conversation and questions. So if there's stuff that pops up that, file it away, and we'd love to get to that. And so that's sort of the idea, is talking about experiencing life in this information ecosystem and what are good approaches, strategies for navigating it, but also some of the challenges that we're all facing. So we're going to talk about that starting first. And Chloe, why don't you kick us off?
Hi, everybody. I'm actually not a firebrand. I'm just an analyst. But this is such a great topic to talk about, because in the arena of democracy, we're really seeing so many opposing teams use information as a football to not only rile people up, but to kind of splinter us into even smaller teams. And this is where, as a policy analyst, I try my best to not only balance the testimonies of people with the reports I read, but also take moments to take in small moments of misinformation like gossip. All of us have participated in misinformation, and what I mean is gossip is something like exaggeration. Some of us exaggerate about things we see, about the traits of people, and often having your perspective is fine, but when it's repeated enough, then it becomes an indicator of someone's character. And in the world of politics, we see how this plays out with how people's activists and politicians' actions are perceived by the public. I say this as someone who thinks that, yeah, I'm left-leaning, but then I got into running for office and people were accusing me of being on the right based on some of the policy ideas that I put forward. And as much as I perceive myself as being one way, once you open yourself up to the marketplace of ideas, people's perceptions of you may not be wrong. It's just different from how you view yourself. And that doesn't mean that their opinion of you is invalid, but it means that you should take it with a different type of weight. So, when I was running for office, using social media, while a lot of people thought like, yeah, she's this firebrand candidate, very articulate, there were hundreds of people sending me messages about, oh, you sweet summer child. How naive of you to think you could ever run for office. You just got out of university yesterday. And the truth is, it's like, yes, I did just leave university 2 months prior, but I'm 30 years old. I've been doing this political thing since Occupy Toronto, and I'm not a sweet summer child. I'm actually quite a seasoned charred chicken. And the truth is that while I wasn't a political candidate, I've been involved in politics for quite some time. And 10 years is enough time in any profession to claim a certain level of expertise. Because not only have you used your senses to perceive different concepts, you've worked with them. And one of them that I would like to address is the labor shortage. This is a word, I don't want to say it's a word, but it's a product that we talk about a lot of the time, and we take these different factors like immigration, education, employment to talk about an issue that really doesn't exist. The truth is, there is not a shortage of people to do work in this country. There's a shortage of good paying jobs that Canadians are willing to take on. Therefore, there is a shortage of Canadians available to take on bad jobs. And when we think about what a bad job is, no matter your political stripe, it's a job that denies you a fair wage, fair access to benefits. And these are certain markers that I use to distinguish what is good policy from bad policy. Because regardless of your beliefs, if you're racist, sexist, whatever, I still have to serve you as a public servant. What I can agree on is that if there is something that denies me dignity, it will most likely deny you dignity. If it denies me equality, it will deny you equality. It might not be immediate, but it will happen over time, because there are very clear indicators of what bad is. It's deprivation, it's poverty, it's malicious violence. And this is where it becomes very important for us as communities to have open channels of communication so that we can clearly identify these markers in our everyday life. Because policy is nothing more than a party of ideas coming together and trying to leave at the end of the night. A lot of us are really stuck, I find, in communicating how politics make us feel. And an issue that I'm really personally feeling this is with the Israel-Palestinian conflict. I've grown up in Toronto my entire life knowing that there are friends that I have that are refugees from Afghanistan, from Lebanon, from Jordan. And as a child, you don't really understand what it means to be a refugee. You just know that your friend cannot go back to their place where they call home. Now that I'm able to see the conditions from the video footage coming from smartphones all around the world, it's hard for me to deny that the thing that my country does is genocide. It's hard for me to deny the conditions that force people here, and it makes it very difficult for me not to have empathy for them. Because if I was in their shoes, I know that I couldn't tolerate the conditions that they live under. And that's a truth that we all live by. And this is how I start to manage gossip, disinformation, and misinformation. What are basic truths that all of us hold? The baseline should be every person deserves dignity, equality, and freedom. In your mind, what do those conditions look like? Freedom of movement, freedom of choice, freedom to affiliate with whatever ideas resonate with you. The opposite of that is when governments and authorities bar those interactions from happening. And regardless of what social group you belong to, you should be able to recognize that if you couldn't live by those conditions, someone else who's living with the same social class as you probably can't endure those conditions as well. And this is why I constantly speak to the working class, because right now, politics is really fracturing us as a class. The middle class, the lower class, poverty, people in encampments. All of these labels start to dehumanize us as a community, because the homeless, that is a label on people who are denied housing. That is the root cause of the issue of homelessness. It's not that these people are so different from us that they can't maintain housing. It's that they've been denied the opportunity to secure it. And when we think about misinformation, I always want you to center an object in it. It's very rarely that people don't want peace, freedom, safety. It's the object in what politics says, who gets what when. So when we're talking about an issue like housing in the city, is the issue that people choose to be homeless? No. I can't imagine not wanting shelter in a place like Canada where you have winter, construction, and a variety of really irritating things to my senses that don't allow me to function. When we talk about why housing isn't happening, is it because the homeless have so much power that they're refusing housing to be built? No. It's politicians, it's homeowners, it's a variety of parties and social groups that don't want to accept that people with disabilities, mental illness, substance abuse issues can live peacefully with them. And that is the object that we need to be trying to address. Calling people NIMBYs, calling them all sorts of names, detracts from addressing the actual object that we're trying to see flourish. So as an analyst, when I'm looking at a variety of issues such as homelessness, youth employment, youth violence, I rarely look at people and say, you are the problem. I try to look at them as an object in an environment. What is happening around them to make them react in this way? Because I don't know how many of you have raised children, but they're such a really great example of reaction. They don't have the ability to communicate, so they'll just react with like an emotional rawness that reminds me that a lot of us are children still just reacting to different traumas, different stimulation from our environment. So when we're looking at different policy issues in our city, don't look at the people, look at the object of power that's being discussed at the center of it. Transit, we just had, I don't know how many of you were like clenched because of the strike, but I worked really hard not to blame the TTC workers for the strike. The issue that the workers are striking for is the quality of the machine they're trying to operate, which is the TTC. The TTC is constantly underfunded, and this is a responsibility that falls to government, not the workers of TTC, and that helps me to maintain a certain level of objectivity about how I address the problem. So when you're dealing with issues of the heart, try not to think about how you're going to change the person. Try thinking about how do you bring the person onto your project team to fix the issue. Because everyone comes with a different talent and a component to fixing something. It's your job as an ally to help them figure out their power and how to use, I don't want to say use their tool, but to wield their talent into a useful testimony to fixing something, if that makes sense. I realize like I'm not the smartest person on every subject, but what I can do is direct you to someone who's an expert at that. And that is as much responsibility that I'm willing to take on, and that's as much responsibility as any of us can take on. It helps us to build a chain, and ultimately that's going to counter disinformation, because the more we trust each other, the closer we can get to the truth. So yeah, thank you.
I have a question. So in terms of like this age where misinformation and disinformation is so prevalent, so you're in a position where you can direct people, and in your work where you can direct people to good information, but there are so many people out there looking for information, and Craig, I think about what your work at ProPublica, where we're looking for information, and a lot of the things, the sources from which people seek it, there's misinformation, right? Like even images from the war or from current events, people are seeing images and being told they're not real. Mm-hmm. Or like how can people navigate without, you know, like a reliable advocate if the media, or not media, the digital world is their source?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to talk about that. I mean, I think, you know, Chloe talking about sort of in the moment, the emotional piece, this how you see someone, and you're talking about sort of, you know, think about the object and reframe it a little bit. And I think that sort of goes a little bit to navigating this environment as well, is how do you not get swept up in the easy thing, the emotional thing that's being fed to you. And one of the ways that false or misleading information tends to get up that acceleration and move, or just really be something that we take in individually, is because it gets our emotions up. And a lot of the time, that is the key thing that people who are consciously creating that stuff is trying to do, is create something that gets an emotional reaction out of you. Anger, happiness, you know, a strong emotion starts to reduce the skepticism piece. We can't sit there and reframe it and think about it and take a step back like Chloe's talking about, because it's triggering very innate human things in us. And so part of it is, for me, it's like that awareness of in yourself. And so sometimes I talk about sort of like emotional skepticism, of realizing in the moment, I read this thing, it really pissed me off, and I absolutely believed it, and I was about to reshare it, right? And that is 100%, you know, could be a scenario where someone is trying to trigger you into that reaction. And so that first piece of kind of being conscious and thinking about, I'm consuming this information, it made me feel great because it told me exactly what I already believed and made me want to share it. Or it really angered me because it goes against what I believe, and it also made me want to share it for that reason, right? And so that's like the first piece, is the awareness of that element of the emotional drive in it. And also the second part of that related is, where are you coming from? Our existing knowledge and our existing experiences shape the way that we consume information. And it's something that happens unconsciously. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, you are who you are, you bring things to the table, your life experience, all that. These are not bad things, but they affect how we consume information. That's just like factually true, psychologically true. We do not get a piece of information and sit there and rationally look at it. We have a very quick reaction. And the key thing is, to sort of borrow your language around reframing it, is like you have to be able to take a step back and reframe for a second and think, okay, so why is it that I immediately believe this and I immediately reject that? Is it because of what I have learned? Is it because of what I have seen? And it doesn't mean you're wrong, but you actually have to think about it. So you have to think about how you're thinking and how you're encountering information. And so like that's one part of it. Yeah.
Well, it's like when you hear gossip about a friend, you sometimes have that visceral reaction of like, that's a lie. Like, I know this is not true. And when you critically interrogate that, it's like, why do I feel this way? And this is where it's like trusting your gut is still a very good thing, because when I look at stories from across the world, it's just like, particularly when I think about Gaza, it's just like, this doesn't feel right. I have friends from Jordan. I have friends from Lebanon. I have friends that grew up from all these places that can't return. This doesn't feel right. And it should force you to go look for testimonies. One of the bigger stressors in my life is like my mom gets a lot of information from YouTube and WhatsApp. And this is something that I don't think a lot of mainstream media realizes, but coming from a Jamaican community where we didn't see our face in mainstream media, we have so many other sources of newspapers, media channels, media personalities, and it blends what you believe with what you need to believe living in Canada. Because during COVID, I remember my mom telling me, like, you should cut an onion because your grandmother said to, and it'll absorb the COVID. And we got in a fight over this. I think COVID misinformation was like a huge riff in my social groups because I grew up as a kid getting immunizations. All of a sudden, that information is incorrect. It's dangerous. People are talking to me about the Tuskegee experiments from the US and how the government misleads Black people to get medical support. But it's like, my reality as a Black Canadian is like, I should trust my medical systems, the healthcare system. They haven't steered me wrong, and at the age of 33, like, I'm still alive. So this is where, like, as an individual, trust some of your gut reactions, but don't always verbalize them, because it's important to hear people out about the why they're accepting this information. A lot of the time, like, as North Americans, we're not really good at addressing fear, because fear is something that alerts predators. Like, I hear politicians using this language all the time, but it's just like, weaponizing fear, it creates such an opportunity for tyrants and strong men to come up, because it's like, yeah, people are desperate. They need a leader. And some people smell that in the air, and you have to be aware of when those people smell that. Because now they're looking at everyone around and they're trying to figure out, like, how do I splinter them up so that I can take different levels of power from them? And that's where, something as small as gossip, it's fine in a social group. But then how does that start to move around a community? How does that start to mark people in different ways to allow exclusion or inclusion? And I see this in different cultural communities, because it's like, my parents are in their 60s. They have a very different idea of what liberalism is compared to me as a Jamaican Canadian child. And some of the things that I'm willing to accept go in direct conflict with the things that allow them to be included in our community. So, yeah.
Yeah, gossip and rumor mongering, these are very normal human behaviors. These are things we all engage in. And what often drives that is something, you're talking about the war in Gaza and what have you. I mean, scenarios where we're trying to make sense of the world is basically what we are trying to do every single day. And information is supposed to assist us in that process of taking in information, figuring out what is going on, what is my interaction with this person, with these larger systems, where do I fit inside everything. And so when we have gaps of information, part of it is appealing to things we already believe or we already know. That is a very good way to, like, energize somebody. Giving someone contradictory information is a very good way to make them just naturally say, I don't want to hear that. Like, this is true in all of us. But the idea of, like, rumor mongering and gossip, like, this is natural human tendency because we're trying to fill in the gaps that we have, but it's also a social activity. And so now, because we all have these phones, we have the WhatsApp groups, we're connected, we have this sort of simulation of social activity that is information oriented. And so it feels kind of fun in some ways for a lot of people, of, like, sharing and gathering the information together in a group. But that can often lead to you sort of going down a wild path, because there's something called group polarization, which is the more you are there reinforcing each other's views, the more extreme you become. And so these are all dynamics that I think they're playing out in really big ways that are genuinely different, I think, now than, say, 20 years ago, because the information environment has changed really, really dramatically, but also really, really quickly. Like, that's the other part of it. I think there's actual physiological and psychological things where we're trying to adapt to it. And then there's innate human behaviors that we do see people seizing upon and playing on emotion and that kind of thing. And so, for me, that first level of the awareness of the dynamics of that is really important, because that's one of the best ways to start kind of defending yourself a little bit about it, is to really think about what you're giving your attention to. And to think about why you are accepting certain things and rejecting certain things, and what your gut is telling you. But also, there's a strategy that's called lateral thinking or lateral reading, which is, okay, I've got this thing in front of me, and they're saying this. What else can I find out about this topic? Maybe I'll move away from this particular post, this particular website. Maybe I'll go and I'll search in, Google News, which has a whole bunch of different news organizations from around the world, and see what else is there. And so those are like, if you're looking for practical tips, that kind of thing of not getting caught up in the thing that is just in front of you and actually trying to learn a little bit more and get out of that emotionally driven moment to just sort of see what else is out there. That doesn't mean it's wrong. It doesn't mean you're wrong. But now at least you're not just going with what's in front of you in that emotional moment. And that's like, to me, a really helpful, simple activity that really assists you in this environment of not getting caught up in that one message and that one thing that's in front of you, but think about where else can I go? Now, the downside of that is, because we have this much greater, open, more democratic media environment, which is such a good thing, more voices, more people can participate. The downside of that is like you could be going and sort of doing your own research and just end up in a completely wild, crazy conspiracy community, right? And it's like, wow, I found these 10 websites. They all say the same thing because they're all like of this one particular point of view. And so that's where being able to actually evaluate information comes in handy. And so like for me personally, and I think this is a good thing I thought maybe we could talk about, is like how do you evaluate information? And for me, like when I'm reading things, one of the first things I look at is obviously, where did this come from? So the source. Is this familiar to me? Have I seen it before? What is this? Who is this person? So not just like seeing what they've said, but then being, okay, so what is their profile or what is this website? So the source piece. And then the second is like the claim. So I tend to be very claim oriented when I'm reading news of like, well, what is supposedly the new thing here? Or what is the thing that happened that caused this, someone to share this with me or write this up or do this video? So what is the claim? And then what is the evidence? And so I'm open to finding new sources and reading and hearing things from people and outlets and stuff that I've never heard of before. I think that's really important to be open like that. But I also want them to kind of show me the goods a little bit. So what are you claiming? What do you have to back that up? And, if you start reading like that, you'll see like, okay, so this is actually a very emotionally driven piece of opinion writing, and it's this person's opinion, but there's not actually evidence in this. So it's an opinion. That's not a bad thing, but that's what it is. And so I tend to be claim oriented and evidence oriented. And as a reporter, I like to see what is this reporter put together to actually support the thesis in the headline or what have you. And I think the element of kind of being aware of looking for your own emotional reactions and being patient, and then looking at where is this coming from, what are they claiming, and what do they have to back it up. As practices, those for me are like the fundamental things. I mean, there are like tools or things out there, sure, but at the end of the day, it's like either you can read closely or you can't, and you can think about what's being put in front of you and what's supporting it or not. And if you can do that and practice that, because it is a skill, it helps with the navigation. It's not perfect, but it helps. So that's sort of the way I come at it from like a journalism background. What about you? Yeah. Oh, is a question? Okay.
Yeah, and also knowing what the motivation for the person who's creating that content is.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people who work from media outlets like radio, where I work, for example, and I'm not saying that people do this around me, but I've noticed that there's often a time crunch, and you're being paid to do a job, and you have to do it within that amount of time. So at the end of the day, the motive can be money as opposed to actual proper information. So, and there's a lot of regurgitation of information and time crunch and money behind it. So that's can lead to.
For sure.
That's what, when we talk about motivation and like intention and claim, I use this small system called satire, sarcasm, and sardonicism. And I use it because we're living in a time where like truth is stranger than fiction, and the writers of The Simpsons and South Park are just knocking it out of the field, in my opinion. And it's because when you think about the motivations of the writer, it's like, are you trying to slander someone? Are you trying to inform me? And when it's misinformation and disinformation, I find authors often lean on like building up satirical comparisons. They lean a lot on like sarcasm in terms of what the solution is. And the solution is like, oh, well, they should have just behaved better. Be serious, you know what I mean? And this is where, like, I find, like, animation to be so interesting right now, because it's like, yeah, The Simpsons feels like it's predictive, but it's really just looking at human behavior and using this satirical approach to showing you how ridiculous some of the things you're hearing in real life are. And if that's the tone that real life officials are using, you should deeply interrogate, like, what is your goal here? Another thing that I try to do as an analyst, because there's opinion pieces and then there's actual reporting. And this is where I'm finding, particularly in government, with the use of consultants, reports can be used to skew a lot of money in different directions. So when we're talking about, like, reports, I use PESTLE. And PESTLE is just a method for analysis and policy, but it's like, who are the political actors? Who are the economic actors, the social groups that benefit from this, the technology that is going to be used, the legal procedures that exist, and finally, the environmental reality of what will be required. Because every policy will require resources. Whose world is it going to change? And I think it's, like, if you really want to address disinformation and misinformation, you have to have empathy, because it's really easy to get swept up in emotions. And, like, to be honest, I think I do my part to share a little bit of misinformation, because I do love memes. I love sarcasm. Canadians are very sarcastic, and you don't realize it until you're meeting people from other communities, and they're like, why do you do this? And it's like, as a Canadian, I don't realize that. It's like, yeah, when I'm talking, it's like, oh yeah, well, it could have been like that. And they're like, just say what you mean. And I started to realize this when I interacted with people from Eastern Europe. They don't do sarcasm. They're always just like, why aren't you saying what you mean? And this is something where you have to be aware of, like, the cultures you're interacting with as well, because Caribbean people don't take sarcasm easily either. They're like, why are you lying? And then they use this as, like, a reason not to believe you again. So yeah, it's really important to understand, like, what is the tone of this information? Are you trying to belittle people, slander people? Are you trying to elevate them? And when it comes to information, once you grind out all the factors, what raises to the top? And I bring up pesto because I like making pesto. And when you, like, put in all the ingredients, what rises to the top is, like, goodness. When you grind up an issue, what's at the top of it? What are the tones that are left at the bottom? And I try to use a lot of, like, visuals, because honestly, as you work with communities with disabilities, you start to realize not everyone has the same, like, sensory availability to, like, say, well, I saw this happen, or I smelled this happen, or I heard this happen. You need to be able to take on different qualifiers to validate people's truths.
Just, on the question, I think one of the things that it raises is the question of incentives. And there's, like, the incentives that drive the information environment we're in, and there's also the incentives specifically in newsrooms. And all these things can have really big impact. So, like, incentives, for example, when we think about social platforms or search platforms, you have massive for-profit companies that are operating these. And so in those places, and I've, like, done a lot of reporting on them and talked to a lot of people who work there and build these systems. I mean, for example, at Facebook, forever, the priority has always been growth. How do we get people to spend more time on our platform? How do we get them to share more content? How do we get them to friend more people? And so the incentive in the organization is grow, 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 and obviously meet our quarterly objective, right? And so in those organizations, you have people whose jobs are safety-oriented and information quality-oriented, but they will get overruled by people who are growth-oriented. And so, and then they build the systems that themselves are saying, okay, so what content is getting the most shares, the most comments, and how do we identify that so we can show it to more people, because that might make them, engage more. And this is what happened at a lot of these social platforms for a long time, where it was just about how do we get people to spend more time and engage more with content. And what ended up winning was the stuff that was most extreme. The stuff that was often false or misleading, or, borderline violent, or that would get an emotional reaction out of people. And there's a lot of data that supports this now, and it's come from different ways. Like, for example, I mean, I did a story in 2016 about like these teens and young men in North Macedonia who were running pro-Trump websites, not because they cared about Trump, not because they cared about American politics for the most part, but because they found that when they ran sites supporting Clinton or Bernie Sanders or Trump, the ones that had articles about Trump did the best on Facebook because they had the craziest headlines and the craziest claims. And so these guys, all they cared about was, how do I get people to have the most engagement on my Facebook page, because that makes them click to my website where I earn ad revenue. So they were almost a pure test of what Facebook was rewarding during the 2016 election. And so they ended up just like copying and pasting the craziest, most false pro-Trump stuff, anti-Hillary Clinton stuff, because it earned them, in some cases, like literally thousands or tens of thousands of dollars a month. They were like the richest people in this small town in North Macedonia. They were buying new cars, they were going to the club and popping bottles. Like, it was crazy. They were earning more money in a month than their parents would earn in a year, because they realized what was being rewarded on Facebook. And so, you know, this has been the scenario of the incentives of these systems that are like capturing attention and tracking us to figure out what we interact with and what we like, so that they can then turn around and recommend more content to us that they think will get us to spend more time. And so like that incentive, and just as you're navigating these platforms, be aware that that is the dynamic. And the stuff that you, not even that you click on, but even when you're scrolling and you stop, they track that. And so you don't even have to watch the whole video. They're like, oh, Craig watched that. And so now we're going to give him more of that because he scrolled past 5 things. And so the incentives of how the systems are built really matters. And then the incentive in newsrooms also matters, of like time pressure, of also who's in charge and who's making the decisions. You know, who are the people in the room saying we're going to cover this and not cover that? For a long time, it was mostly people that look like me, let's be honest, right? It was, and so it's changed a bit. But the incentives in newsrooms of what gets rewarded in terms of who reads something more, usually something a little more extreme, a hot take or what have you, and who is deciding what the incentives and what gets rewarded in a newsroom. And all of these things in different ways can really determine the kind of information that we interact with. And I think for people consuming it, we should guard our attention and think about how valuable that is, because everybody wants it, professional media, social media. And if you take control of that a bit and think about what you're looking at and what you're not looking at, then you may be taking a little bit of power back.
So I just have a quick question. There is a tendency for people to be more interested in the most salacious, most scandalous, most extreme stories and content. And I was just, how do you... It's hard sometimes to get somebody interested in a story about some things that genuinely matter, that are not as glamorous, not as like. Mm-hmm. I covered housing and politics in Cambridge, Massachusetts. When I was doing some freelance work down there after journalism school. And this wasn't necessarily the news that everybody wanted to talk about. There were a few very dedicated people mm-hmm. who love talking about housing, but like by and far, this is not something that people really like cared about for the most part. So how do you get people to care about the things that matter in the community?
Do you want to talk from a policy perspective? Yeah.
Yes. So one of the things that I did during the election was really take advantage of streaming, because ultimately the things that my mom talks about are very different than what I talk about as a 30-year-old. And we're both concerned about poverty. Poverty for someone at 60 is pensions. For me, it's housing. And knowing what that looks like for the community you're targeting makes people care. Because, yeah, my mom belongs to this group of women in their 60s that are, as I call them, on their second wave. They're free. No children, husbands are in the garage or they're being divorced. And for them, it's like poverty is a very big issue for women because they don't have pensions. They grew up not being able to access credit. So being able to create stories that really center their reality is important for how you get them to move on it. Because yeah, when I talk to my mom about seniors losing their places in long-term care homes, that's when she cares about homelessness. When I talk about youth homelessness, she's like, why don't they just get a job? And it's like, okay, Mom, let me show you my emails and the 400 jobs I've applied to and no one answers. And that's where she gets it. Because ultimately, I think one of the things we really need to invest in as people is like getting to know our neighbors. We take for granted that like art does a lot of universal talking for us, but we also forget the people that do that are very talented. When I think about arts funding, there is a desperate need for all of us that are non-artists to support artists so that we can start better messaging what it is that we want from politics, policy, culture change. And I think that even things like this, it's like I have journalists that I trust more than institutions. Colin DeMello, Robert Benzie. It wasn't like that when I was a kid. You know the Toronto Star, the Sunday Sun. Now it's like I know the journalists by name and face and I trust them more because like I've seen them, I've spoken to them directly, and that humanizes their work to me. And that's missing from all of our community advocacy right now. Even the unions, it's like, okay, we do a Zoom thing and like, why aren't you showing up to our rallies? And it's like, because you're still not understanding what's affecting me as a worker. It's not just collective bargaining. It's the fact that there's not enough of us saying like housing is an issue that we need to solve for all generations, not just young people. Because yeah, it's like there's so much to say now. How do you visualize it? You know what I mean? Symbols are something that every culture understands. A stop sign, bring that anywhere. People know what a stop sign is. What does the end of homelessness look like? And that's where it's like, we need to employ the visual artists, the social, I'm going to say this very cautiously, but social media influencers. There are people on social media my mom trusts more than me, who she birthed, sent to school. Yeah. Like, you know what I mean? And this is where it's like, it's important to start to kind of interact with other people's media, because it's like, how do you know your family's being misinformed until you start arguing with them? And that's where it's like, yeah, I don't take my phone calls with my mom for granted anymore, because it's like, I need to know what you were watching on Instagram, YouTube, because this is going to shape the direction of this conversation. And ultimately, it's going to shape the way that I approach the conversation, because my mom doesn't like Chloe Brown, the analyst. She wants to talk to her daughter. And ultimately, that will soften how I give her information, because my mom was one of those vegans who gets influenced by the influenzas of health. And it's rapidly changed the way that we interact about things, because, well, this person said they're a doctor, and it's like, how do you know that? They could have gotten their degree from like Trump University. How do you know this? So yeah, there's a way to break down false information, but we need to take a better approach to how we do it, because everyone has different literacy levels.
I mean, your question is like, I think newsrooms have struggled with that forever, right? Like I keep looking at the food issue cover there with the big bunch of kale, because what happens in newsrooms is people are like, well, how do we get them to eat their vegetables? Is basically like literally what editors say. Sure, the fun stories, the ones that are like guaranteed to get people talking, you sort of know what those are, and those are always part of the mix. And there's incentives towards doing more of those. And then the really serious ones that dig into a serious issue, it's like, well, how do we get people to read it? And I think, one of the things that journalists and newsrooms have typically done a bad job of is really trying to make it as relatable as possible. Like usually we'll do a lead and it's got one person in it sort of telling their story, but how do we make people see themselves in our work? And that's something that I think people are trying to figure out more. One of the things that the newsroom I work at has been doing for now, I guess, close to 20 years is we will often like put out community calls. We actually have a team of journalists. They're our community engagement team. And it's not just, usually it's sort of like community engagement in newsrooms means, here's the stuff we produced. Now take it and enjoy it, community. Like, read our thing, right? So what they've started doing, and I'm like only been there 3 years, so I don't get any credit for this, but we will, on certain stories, we will actually like put call outs to the community. And we will say, we are reporting on this. Can you tell us about what your experience has been? And in some cases for communities where, they're not necessarily online, where we might put a page on our website, we will print up flyers, we will send people to community events, and they will hand out the flyers saying, hey, have you had an experience, with this local landlord or what have you? And so I think finding ways to really connect and to find ways to bring people into our journalism so that it informs it, and it's not just us producing it and shoveling it out there saying, why don't you read it? Why don't you eat our vegetables? Like that. That's something I think we all really struggle with. And most journalists, if you talk to, like, they really care about that and they want to do it, but our newsrooms aren't really engineered and built to do that. And it's a problem.
And this is where it's like targeted marketing is something we kind of need to do, because it's like, I try to package policy like Pepsi. People are loyal to Pepsi and Coca-Cola. They'll fight each other about it. And it's like, why? Because it can fit in their hand. It's something that's basic and they can understand. And this is where it's like, what is the end product of what you're trying to do? You cannot directly tell people to change their morality, but if you get them to interact with something and it allows them to start to wrap their minds around, like, how does this work in my world? It makes it easier to plot that change. And that's something that I think social activists need to take easy on themselves. You're not going to change your mom and dad who have come through like the Cold War and a variety of social events that they can't even like articulate about how it affects them. But you can help them understand how things in your reality affect them as well. So, yeah.
Hi. Yeah, it's on. Okay.
Cool.
So those of us who are in this room are highly motivated and we care. The reality is polarization, fragmentation, the business model for journalism is collapsing. People are avoiding the news because psychologically, post-pandemic, they can't handle it. And now Google is telling us they'll Google for us with AI. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the experts that I've talked to are basically telling me that the middle is going to drop out. And what I mean by that is whoever can afford to make content will be a direct line into AI, and everybody in between will just disappear because they can't compete. And I don't know if that's right or wrong, but what I would love to hear your opinions on is, with all this disruption and the fatigue in the audience, and also, a potentially fascist government in the US and political, like, where are we going and what will AI do within this context? I know it's a very dark question, but
no.
I can't stop thinking
you really
about
brought
it.
us up.
I'm
Thank
so
you
sorry.
So much. No.
I can't stop thinking about it.
I mean, as I can feel yeah. Do you want to?
Okay, so this is how you start a revolution.
All right.
I think that there's hope to be optimistic, because we're actually confronting the fact that we want to be included. Instead of just trying to, try to be the John Tories of the world, it's like, I'm okay with being Chloe, and I want to see that through. And I think media has an opportunity to do what Craig is talking about, like enlist people. Citizen journalism has taught us, like, there is capacity out there. If you're trying to build literacy, it requires like active practice. Like, kids are not born learning how to read. Like, you have to sit with them, mouth out the words. And even after teaching them the words, comprehension is a different story. I'm learning this with like a 5 and 6 year old, where it's like, you guys can talk about strike all you want. Do you know what labor history is? Like, you know what I mean? So it requires that we start actually trying to learn about each other and help each other. And in my experience, that means like cooperatives. I'm really trying to push for cooperatives, because what we want as the working class is greater ownership of our lives. We actually have to become the executives we want to see if we intend to save our industries, because private equity has no ideas, just like endless appetite. And if we as workers want to save our industry, it's like, why we have to confront why we're paying them. And it's because a lot of us I don't want to say a lot of us, but it's like accountability, legal accountability is terrifying. Getting served with a lawsuit, just in theory, is terrifying. But it's like, if all of us band together, we can fight this. And I think a lot of us are starting to slowly learn that, because the truth is, North America teaches you to reject cooperation. It's dog eat dog out there. Only one can rise to the top, yet 6 billion people are here. And that's where it's like, we have to invest in each other. I have to be invested in actually trying to help you. And I don't have to forget about who we are, but it's like, what is actual equity between us? Because as I think about like, what would it take to flip my mom into revolution? It's like, I have to bring more of her peers. My mom will not do anything I say. I'm her child. And she loves to remind me of that. So it's like, how do I help her see my world by showing how her peers exist in my world and how I respect their knowledge, what they're capable of, etc. So yeah, media needs to work on enlisting more people into being better reporters, better archivists, better speakers, because we really struggle with a communication gap. And that's where McKinsey can come in and be like, this is how we're gonna solve things, because you don't speak political legalese. So yeah, educate each other, help each other, and then like take over the enterprise.
I think like it can feel really disempowering, and honestly, like I have overall a negative feeling about where like the media business is going. Like, it's true, the advertising model has fallen out. It's really, really hard to make it as a media business. But I think there are hopeful things if you think small, is like the first piece I would say. And it's not just because they invited us here, but honestly, I'm really happy that the West End Phoenix exists in this city and in this neighborhood. It makes me happy, not just because I'm a journalist, but it's like, it's a nice community thing, and they bring you people together. So small things like that, of whatever you're able to support, you should, just like you should take control of your attention. You should think about what kind of information and media do you want to support in your community, in your neighborhood. What is like worth your time and your attention and whatever money you can give. Because if you value yourself and your attention and those things, and then you choose to give it consciously, then you're going to vote with that. And if we think about like they're rolling out AI into everything and that kind of thing, if people don't use it and people don't like it, they don't have a choice. And so it's easy to feel disempowered, but it actually matters what you do. It matters what you're looking at, what you're giving your attention to, which apps you open or don't open. It matters which features you use or don't use. All of those things can actually reverberate if people think about that and kind of voting with their attention and their activity and where possible their wallet. And so it's like, it's easy to feel disempowered. I feel it too. Like, I work in the industry and I look around, I'm like, man, things are really awful compared to where they were 20 years ago in terms of jobs for journalists and people in journalism being able to spend time to produce good work. But there are a lot of good small outlets in Canada, you know, not just West End Phoenix, but like the Narwhal and other things like that, that they're, you know, as we're seeing the decay of the big mainstream ones, there's still some hope there. So like that's the sort of optimistic thing I would say, but also the empowering thing of like, you actually can make a difference. You really can.
I think we will do one more question.
Sure. Yeah.
If that's okay. Okay.
Oh, this is a lot of pressure. I'm super worked up right now.
It's good. Let it out. Let's go.
And also might end on a doomsday. I feel super optimistic.
You're going to get worse than her? Really?
No, I know. It's kind of similar because I feel right now like from 33 up, we're gold. We're good, right? Because you're probably the youngest person in this room.
Oh, thank you.
What happens? What happens? You talk a lot about emotion. You talk a lot about critical thinking and reading and, you know, finding the right sources. What happens for the next wave of people that are coming up whose frontal cortex was being developed over the last 8 years in the peak of what we've seen so far in mis and disinformation? Like what then? Because there's apathy. You know, there is no emotion anymore. It's hopelessness and it's scroll by. It's they're not even taking in and feeling one way or the other.
It depends on where you are, because Gen Alpha, I think they have this world called Roblox, and that's where they do a lot of their socializing, and like it's not necessarily a bad thing because they do we need to recognize there's not a lot of spaces where we allow young people to exist. When I was a kid, like, you could play shinny on the road. Now, you'll be lucky if someone doesn't call the police. And this is where it's like we as the adults in the room need to have more faith in our neighbors no matter what age they are. Because ultimately, it's like, I'm not the same person that I was when I was 16. I do not like 16-year-old Chloe. She was a menace. And this is where it's like, through the grace of people around me, I've been able to get to this point of being like an expert on really critical issues. And the only way I maintain this expertise is by constantly being challenged by those around me. I have to prove that, not something that is true, but like, what is factual? Because there are so many truths depending on where you grew up, how old you are, the reality that you were forced into, that we need to have grace that some people are not as literate about certain subjects as we are. I'm grateful for the teachers that didn't chastise me because I was ignorant. I'm still grateful that people don't like chastise me because I'm ignorant, because yeah, at 33, like, what do I really know? I only know what I've been told, what I've been witnessing through documentaries, and then validating through like complimentary documentaries on YouTube. So there's still so much room to grow. We as like activists need to give ourselves and others more grace, because emotions are very like, they're very quick, but if you allow people to feel that emotion and then try to rationalize with them after, you can do a lot of impact. And that's where during the election, it's like, yeah, I got you guys riled up, but then I tried to lay out plans that were logical. And that's ultimately where I found success, because if you are a rational person, there's only so much BS that I can put past you. You know what I mean? And this is where it's like, we have to work together to be the BS detector. You know what I mean? This is where it's important to have community conversations. I talk to my parents, my grandparents, to validate certain experiences. And I do that because often people try to tell me discrimination's not real. They're like, oh, well, like, black people got the vote, women got this. That's true, but it's like, in 1989, my mom couldn't get a credit card. I can get a credit card now. I understand as an adult what it's like not to be able to access credit. I need to apply that to other populations that are facing that. You know what I mean? And this is where it's like, don't lose hope. Just build faith in being able to talk to your neighbor, because that's really all that's going to change this, especially as we're seeing like Pierre Poilievre and the PC party like really building a campaign on dividing us as communities. What does your neighbor say? What does the person you actually see every day believe? Because that's more true than Pierre Poilievre, who's like disconnected because he holds a certain amount of power. He's isolated. He doesn't know your reality as much as someone who lives next door to you. So like, yeah, don't give up yet. And also, it's just like, share your principles with others, because often we all have the same principles of what goodness is. It's dignity, equality, and freedom. Meet other people with your principles, share them, and like just give grace for people to adopt them, because technology has changed us. Very few of us actually understand how it's changed us. So yeah, just talk more, hold barbecues, get to know people, because that's the only way through this. Technology and Skynet is like our ultimate challenge as humans. Are we gonna give up our executive function to the machine?
I mean, one thing that you can be optimistic about in terms of young people in this whole area is there's an organization in Toronto called Civics. And so for a long time, they've been running, they do education about democracy. And so they work with teachers all across the country. And for many years, they've been running mock elections. Whenever there's a provincial election or a federal election, they teach students about elections, they let them vote, do that whole thing. And so several years ago, they started integrating into that, because they have a channel into almost every school in the country. They started integrating media literacy and digital literacy into that. And so myself and then some other people who are experts in the area of like training people how to do this, they created a whole curriculum. And so now when they go in and they train students about democracy, they're also teaching them all right, how do we read and navigate information? How do we do that? And the teachers are taught how to do this, and the teachers bring it into their newsroom, or they're not their newsroom, their classroom. And so that's like, this is a national scale program. It's been going on for several years now. And, and I think that's the kind of thing that is now being funded and put forward in the country. So like, that's, if you want to sort of end on a positive note, like that is something that is new, that's been going on. More school districts and provinces are trying to think about this. And as much as there's a lot of doomsday stuff about, screen time and what have you, the truth is it is still so new that the science isn't settled on that. And there's been like recent books that are saying basically like, yeah, we're screwing all these kids. It's, but we don't know 100% what the deal is yet. And so that's like, the scary part is, sure, in 10 years we may realize, yeah, they're fucked. Everybody's fucked, right? But that's not where we are now. And there's reason to believe it maybe is not as bad as we have felt it's been the last few years. So we shouldn't feel hopeless. We shouldn't feel it's irreversible. We should think about what can we do and how can we connect on our scale in our community, but also, what do we want from our institutions in terms of supporting everyone of every age on this. I think those are all things that we can think about, but there is some reason for positivity. So maybe that helps a little bit to end on. Yeah.
That's probably a really great note to end this session on. Let's have a big round of applause for Craig Silverman and Corey Brown. Thanks so much. Don't feel like you have to leave immediately. We've got a few minutes to just kind of put a bow on this. I just wanted to mention one thing about cooperation and community and stuff too. I met a lawyer named Joe Burke about 25 years ago in Ottawa at a hockey tournament, and everybody thought he looked like George Lucas. And we went to a party, and he fell asleep, and people were taking his pictures with him, and Instagram tagged me and George Lucas. Anyways, Joe came up from Massachusetts. He was a social justice warrior, a lawyer, and he was the guy also who, when people would go to the drunk tank, he would represent them. He was a public defender. Joe passed away. He bled to death on his way to an Ottawa Red Blacks game, CFL team, football game. So he passed away. 3 of his friends wanted to honor his legacy. Also lawyers and social justice lawyers. And so we have a partnership with the Joe Burke series that we publish in the West End Phoenix. In the new issue, there's a Joe Burke supported story about black burial grounds in the far West End. And it's written, the piece is written by a writer named Daisha Lopi, who's brilliant. And Daisha showed up about 2 hours ago to collect her papers with her story in it to deliver it to her neighbors. So this started down the line in Ottawa with a white social justice lawyer, and now it ends up with the story of black burial grounds in the West End. So cooperation and community and getting out of your lanes and coming together in the name of storytelling and journalism is possible, and that's a vanguard that we hope to continue to push forward. Thanks for being part of it, and we'll see you again.